Well, it's fairly safe to say Fallout 4 got a mixed reception. There are lots of folks who outright hate the game, and there are others who like it. The subject of whether Fallout 4 is a good game, or indeed a good Fallout game, has been done to death, so we're not going to be discussing that today. Instead, we're going to look towards the future. Bethesda currently has two in-house franchises, The Elder Scrolls and Fallout. The two games have very different settings, which explore different themes and ideas, but mechanically they're very similar. It's roughly the same core experience with two different coats of paint, but there are some notable differences in the way Bethesda have chosen to approach these two franchises. And there are also many ways in which the two bounce off of one another, and features from one tend to creep into the other. They don't seem to develop these games simultaneously either, which means their releases come one after the other, alternating between the two series, with the developers taking the lessons learned from each and carrying it to the next across the franchise boundary. At least for now. There are rumours that Bethesda are working on a brand new third franchise, but nothing's been confirmed yet. In this video, I basically want to examine a lot of the new features present in Fallout 4, in addition to things that were removed, as well as the change in overall design philosophy, and use that to speculate a bit on what the next game, presumably The Elder Scrolls 6, is going to look like. We'll have to look at their previous games too, in order to establish certain trends when it comes to what gets carried across, and what new things are added as well. And from this, we might be able to get a decent idea of where they're going in the future. Of course, this is ultimately all just idle speculation, and I expect several years from now, after The Elder Scrolls 6 has been released, I will probably have got a whole bunch of stuff wrong here. So, to be honest, it's a bit of a cheap subject for a video anyway. Doing guesswork as to how the next Bethesda game is going to turn out is kind of the intellectual equivalent of wanking into a sock. So, to be completely honest, I'm not going to pretend this video is anything but an amusing waste of time. Still, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. Alright, so the biggest and probably the most divisive new feature of Fallout 4 was, of course, the Voiced Protagonist. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure if something counts as divisive if the majority of people didn't like it. At least that's the impression I got anyway. Personally, I'm kind of on the fence about it. It has its upsides and downsides, but I guess I didn't hate it enough to remove it with a mod for my Let's Play series, so that's something at least. The big question, though, obviously is this: are voiced protagonists here to stay? The response to this feature was, as I've said, not all that positive. However, as far as Bethesda are concerned, that might not actually matter all that much. People have complained about things they've done before, but Bethesda have a tendency to sort of stick to their guns when it comes to things like this. Off the top of my head, I can't really think of any instances where they've walked back on features that their players didn't like. They made a change to their DLC practices after the whole horse armor thing, but aside from that, I can't think of anything else. Removing the voice protagonist from future games would seem an awful lot like an admission of failure, I think, really, and I don't think Bethesda are willing to do that. I mean, they're certainly not under any pressure to do that, considering, all these top reviews and Game of the Year awards they've been piling up. The only other open-world RPG that can be argued to have outperformed Fallout 4 is The Witcher 3, and, well, The Witcher 3 also has a voice protagonist, so that's not much of an incentive for Bethesda to change things. The chief problem I see here, unfortunately, is that The Elder Scrolls 6 was probably well into pre-production by the time Fallout 4 was released. Bethesda almost certainly had a clear plan for the next game, probably by the time they finished Skyrim, let alone now, so regardless of any backlash, if they've been planning for a voiced main character in The Elder Scrolls 6, I don't think anything will change their mind now, since the work has well and truly already begun. For what it's worth, I think it probably is here to stay. The addition of a voiced main character is a big deal. This is the equivalent of back when they decided to voice act all the NPC dialogue in Oblivion, whereas in Morrowind it was all just text boxes. Loads of people made arguments against this at the time, like the fact that there would be less dialogue overall as a result, and that it would cause problems for mod makers, and that may sound a little familiar, perhaps, but it didn't change Bethesda's minds in the end, and I think the same thing is going to happen here with the voice player characters. However, I'm sure some would be quick to point out, and rightly so, that the voice protagonist was only a part of a larger problem. Other complaints relating to it include the incredibly fixed starting point and character background of the dialogue system itself, so we'll have a look at those as well, I think. Fallout 4's opening is typical Bethesda stuff at this point. It's an extremely flashy opening with lots of bright lights and set pieces and complex animation which sadly doesn't represent the quality of the rest of the game. In Skyrim, it was Alduin's dramatic attack on Helgen, and in Fallout 4 it's the escape to Vault 111 as nuclear bombs are literally exploding in the background. It's very dramatic. It's kind of Hollywood, actually. There's definitely no threads or when the wind blows, that's for sure. All that is par for the course, though. The sticking point for most people was the fact that the player was shoehorned into the role of the sole survivor, which in this case was either a male army veteran or a female law school graduate, both of which are happily married and living in pre-war suburbia. The main quest of the game is also totally attached to this opening and backstory, as you're sent off into the Commonwealth to find your abducted infant son, Sean. Compare and contrast this to Skyrim, for example. You begin as a totally blank slate, a random prisoner captured crossing the border and rather unfairly condemned to execution. Who your character is, where they came from, and why they tried to enter Skyrim in the first place is left completely up to the player. NPCs don't even question your backstory at all, presumably for fear of treading on players' toes. The only thing connecting the player's character to the main plot is the fact that they are the Dragonborn, a fact they will only learn after a little way into the main quest itself. So if you choose to ignore the main quest entirely, the game won't even spawn dragons, and you can continue about your business in Skyrim as if Alduin didn't even exist. Other characters and other guilds and quests will not so much as reference your Dragonborn nature, and while this is a strength of the game when it comes to player freedom, it also contributes to a feeling of getting absolutely no recognition from the NPCs in the world for basically anything you ever do. Previous Elder Scrolls games were the same. In Oblivion, you play the role of a random prisoner in the Imperial City dungeons, who apparently doesn't even know why they were locked up, judging by the dialogue. In Morrowind, you are a prisoner on a ship bound for Vardenfell. Here, there's a little more backstory present. You were born on a certain day to uncertain parents, which miraculously fits an ancient Dark Elf prophecy about the reincarnation of one of their ancient heroes, and this, incidentally, is the reason the Emperor ordered you to be released from prison in the first place. However, beyond this, again, it's fairly open-ended. Character background is mostly left to the player, as is what they choose to do once they leave the opening area. The main quest even bends over backwards to muddy the waters and make it unclear as to whether the prophecy is real or just a load of ancient bullshit that your character happens to vaguely fit by sheer coincidence. Arena and Daggerfall both also have similarly open-ended starting points. So, does Fallout 4's radical departure from this open-ended philosophy mean that we should expect something similar in The Elder Scrolls 6? Well, maybe it could, but I don't think so. I think the only realistic chance of this happening would be if Bethesda were to decide essentially to emulate The Witcher due to that series' popularity and give you a mostly fixed character, but I don't really think that's very likely. Here's the thing. Bethesda have done this before. In Fallout 3, they also threw out their blank slate philosophy in favour of something more directed. In Fallout 3, the player is forced into the role of the Lone Wanderer from Vault 101, and while there's some wiggle room in terms of how you choose to interact with various bits of the opening sequence, it's pretty fixed. You're a kid from a vault who needs to find his or her dad, whether you like it or not. You can choose to ignore this after leaving the vault, of course, but most of the game's content is wrapped up in the main questline, and other characters will still reference the fact that you're from a vault from time to time. So it wasn't any real surprise to me when Fallout 4 did something similar, although this time they flipped the narrative so that it was a parent looking for their child. I reckon people might have been more accepting of this were it not for the fact that when Obsidian made Fallout New Vegas, they seemed to understand the strength of giving the player almost total freedom over their character's origins, and took an approach that has far more in common with the Elder Scrolls games than it does with Fallout 3 or even the first two Fallout games, where you were forced to play as the Vault Dweller and the Chosen One, who both have fairly fixed backgrounds. So to cut a long story short, while I think the voiced main character may be here to stay, I wouldn't bet on the Elder Scrolls 6 having a main character with a fixed backstory. In fact, I fully expect to begin the game, as per tradition, as some form of prisoner of indeterminate origin. It's just one of the cornerstones of that series, and I think Bethesda knows it. So what about the dialogue? Well, Fallout 4's dialogue system got a lot of flack. Again, it's another topic that's been done to death, so I'm not going to keep beating a dead horse on this subject. What I will say is that the dialogue system is one of the few things in Bethesda's games that is constantly changing from game to game. so it's likely to look a bit different in the next one too. I will say that as flawed as Fallout 4's system is, it was for me still an improvement over Skyrim, where most conversations consisted of single replies with virtually no role-playing options whatsoever. Oblivion was somehow even worse in that respect, and in Morrowind you couldn't even make any choices at all, save for one or two extremely rare cases. The dialogue in Fallout 4 for me represents at least some sense of progress versus the previous games, even though it's still hardly brilliant, especially when you compare it to Fallout New Vegas. So realistically, what's the best we can expect from The Elder Scrolls 6 in light of all of this? Well, if I were Bethesda and I were listening to my fans, I'd keep the open-ended blank slate starting point. I'd expand the dialogue system further beyond the 4 yes/no/sarcastic/question options. And if we're going to keep a voiced main character, go the Dragon Age Inquisition route and provide a selection of voices for players to choose from. That's in an ideal world, anyway. The biggest problem with everything I've just said is that more dialogue options plus more voices equals a whole shitload of extra time and money that needs to be spent on the game during production. And that's time and money which could be spent on other things instead. You've got to remember, as big and as successful as Bethesda are, they always end up with cut content in their games that they couldn't finish. In Oblivion, it was the Elder Council that got left out. In Skyrim, they weren't able to make the complex Civil War system they'd originally envisioned. And in Fallout 4, there were a whole collection of quests, items, and perks that were cut from the final release of the game. On the bright side, though, Bethesda's production values do seem to increase with each new game, so perhaps it's not beyond the realms of possibility. But still, it's kind of a tough sell to members of Bethesda's board, I suppose, really. Since we're in the area of discussing things like the main quest, though, let's take a minute to talk about that in a bit more detail. What stood out to me with Fallout 4 in comparison to most of Bethesda's earlier games was a slightly more mature tone and more player choice than usual. The main quest effectively branches off with different factions and has multiple conclusions, in very stark contrast with their other games. The last time Bethesda made a game with multiple main quest endings, of course, was Daggerfall back in 1996. Without wanting to get into spoiler territory too much, I'll also say that many of the characters, including the antagonists, felt a lot more fleshed out, with much more realistic motivations, unlike Mehrunes Dagon, Alduin, and the Enclave in previous games. Kellogg, for example, might just be the most nuanced bad guy that Bethesda have produced since Dagoth Ur in Morrowind. You get a chance to literally see inside his head and discover what makes him tick, and, looking back, actually, that one sequence did more to impress me than any number of Oblivion Gates or Dragon battles Bethesda have thrown at me previously. None of the factions in Fallout 4's main story are inherently good or inherently bad. None are particularly black and white, and instead occupy various shades of grey in between, with the possible exception of the Minutemen anyway. Again, this is a departure from Bethesda's previous games, but for once, I think it's a really good one. As a side note, they've really improved the companion NPCs a huge amount this time around over their incredibly boring copy-pasted counterparts in Skyrim. In Fallout 4, the player's companions actually look and sound unique. They have their own stories to tell and a much greater semblance of personality. There's even a very basic system in place that allows their opinion of you to change over time. Whichever way you want to look at it, that is an objective improvement in my eyes. I hope the next game manages to do the same. I'm hoping that Bethesda decide to continue this trend with The Elder Scrolls 6. I'd love to see another main quest with a few different paths and very few easy choices. If the trailer for the next game comes out and it turns out that once again Tamriel is under threat from yet another extra-dimensional, super evil baddie with absolutely no fucking depth whatsoever, I'm going to be beyond disappointed, but we'll see. This is one of those things that could really go either way. Bethesda might decide to continue on this new path they set out on with Fallout 4, or they could just decide that fighting some big evil discount Sauron has become a pillar of the Elder Scrolls experience at this point. After the backlash they've gotten from Fallout 4, I wouldn't be surprised if they chose to play it safe, but I would still be kind of disappointed. So with all that out of the way, let's look at one of the other pretty huge gameplay changes in Fallout 4, the settlement system. Again, this is another Marmite feature. You either love it or you hate it. Or perhaps you like it, but you wish it had been done a bit better. I, for one, really liked it, actually. It brought me back to the hours I spent decorating my player homes in Morrowind, down to every last book on the shelves. It's obvious Bethesda understood that this element of their games was an important one, and decided to combine it with the Minecraft-induced crafting obsession that seems to have overtaken virtually every AAA game at the moment. And honestly, for the most part, I think it works. And more importantly, I think Bethesda recognises that this feature was a success. It feels like a very natural extension of the Bethesda experience, which has always been about player self-expression in the traditional Western RPG sense. Previously, players would express themselves through their own characters, role-playing, the gear they collected, the factions they joined, and the quests they did. The settlement crafting system in Fallout 4 extends this and allows the players to express themselves in a new way by leaving their mark on the wasteland and reshaping it to their will. I think this feature is here to stay in some form or another. Considering the amount of work that clearly went into it, I'd be very surprised if the system wasn't at least repurposed somehow for the next game, in the same way a lot of their dragon-related coding seems to have been used for making the vertibirds work in Fallout 4. What's interesting is that it might offer some insights as to what kind of setting the Elder Scrolls 6 might contain, if settlement building is to be supported in some way. There would definitely have to be some contrivance of plot which puts the player in a position where they need to build new settlements in a world where plenty already exist. After all, this isn't Fallout, where the world is already destroyed and rebuilding from the ashes is a major theme. Perhaps the Elder Scrolls 6 will take place in the aftermath of a massive war, or other natural disaster. After all, Bethesda seem to enjoy having a lot of the most dramatic changes to their world happen in between their games rather than during them. They have this odd habit of utterly destroying the parts of Tamriel players spent time in previously. After all, they nuked Morrowind shortly after that game concluded, which to this day feels like a bit of a fuck you to the players who spent so many hours adventuring around Vardenfell, but that's a rant for another time. Cyrodiil also got the same treatment, with much of it being destroyed and damaged in the Great War with the Dominion, and I can only imagine what horrible fate awaits Skyrim by the time the Elder Scrolls 6 gets around to starting. My money's on famine or disease or something like that, personally, but we'll see. Alternatively, maybe the Elder Scrolls 6 will take us somewhere completely new. I admit it's probably unlikely, but we could, for example, see the player on an expedition to Akavir, where they need to build and defend Imperial colonies on the new continent. Or maybe the settlement building will fade into the background. The mechanics might remain, but they simply won't be as big a focus as they were in Fallout 4. Perhaps the settlement mechanic will remain Fallout 4's standout gimmick, like the dragons and the Thu'um were in Skyrim. But as I said, I think a lot of people enjoyed this mechanic, and Bethesda can clearly see that, so leaving it out of the next game would honestly seem like a bit of a mistake, so I think it'll still be there in some form or another, along with the new crafting system, which you can bet your ass isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And speaking of gimmicks, actually, you can probably bet that the next game will have one. I've no idea what it's going to be, but it seems to be Bethesda's thing at the moment. They'll undoubtedly be coming up with some new mechanic to replace Oblivion Gates, dragons and dragon shouts, settlement building and power armor, whatever. So what about the nuts and bolts of the game, the character stat systems? Will they get a change up? Well, Dave, that's a stupid question, I hear you say. Of course they will, they always do. And yeah, you're right. For better or worse, as each game goes by, the tabletop RPG origins of both series get further and further left behind by the wayside. With each new Elder Scrolls game since Daggerfall, it seems Bethesda decides to ditch one of the old skills. In Fallout 4, they made the controversial decision to completely throw the old skill system in the bin entirely and replace it with a perk tree. The whole perk tree thing itself is one of the prime examples of a mechanic making its way across the franchise boundary. Perks have always been a part of Fallout, but after Fallout 3, they managed to find their way into the Elder Scrolls as well. Bethesda is quite blatantly very proud of this system, even if their players aren't. At this point, I would not be surprised at all. I mean, if skills are gone from the next Elder Scrolls game, yeah, I mean, you can already see it happening, right? They already ditched attributes in favour of simply adding points to health, magic and stamina after all, so it's not much of a stretch to imagine that the next game will probably feature another perk tree like Fallout 4's, although, of course, this one won't even have the special attributes at the top. To most hardcore series fans, this probably sounds pretty dire. And I don't blame you, really. A perk tree could actually be executed very well and add a fair amount of depth to the game in theory, but while Bethesda is outstandingly good at doing some things, creating a character system with depth is something their current dev team just seems to really struggle with. They seem to place a priority in streamlining existing systems, but not really replacing the missing ones with new stuff. If I was being really optimistic, however, what I might say is that perhaps their work on the settlement building and crafting might impact other areas of the game positively. The magic system, for example, could do with a serious overhaul, and it's my hope that they might opt for a new system that is very open-ended and open to player customization. Of course, Morrowind already provided a system with tons of customization and depth 15 years ago, but I suppose that's besides the point. Alright, well, I could go on for hours about all the little things that will probably appear in the next game, like the quick loot menu and modular armor pieces, and how I imagine the combat is likely going to get a bit of an overhaul, in the same way they did for Fallout 4. They'll probably incorporate some popular stuff made by the modding community as well, but there's not much more to say on those subjects than I already have, and I'll be 100% honest with you here, I'm getting kind of bored of doing this script. If some of this was a bit doom and gloom for some people, though, then let me try and end on a positive note. There are a few things that I can probably guarantee you'll get in The Elder Scrolls 6. For one thing, we're undoubtedly going to get an awesome new world to explore. Bethesda's world design is outstanding, and it has remained consistently very good ever since Morrowind. We certainly all have our preferences for which we prefer the most, but overall, I think they do a great job. In the same vein, the game will almost certainly have an incredible soundtrack. It's something we definitely take for granted, but all of these games have some of the best music made for video games, period, as far as I'm concerned. In fact, it's not only good, but somehow I don't get tired of hearing it even after hundreds of hours, which is actually kind of an impressive achievement when you think about it. Finally, whatever you think of the next game, whether you think it's an improvement or not, the chances are you'll still end up sinking hundreds of hours into it anyway. I know I will. You can make many arguments against Bethesda's games, but I don't think not getting value for money is one of them. And I hope those rumours about them making a third brand new franchise are true, by the way. I think Bethesda could probably do with making something new where they're not going to be judged by fans of previous games in the same series. I'd like to see what they can achieve with a bit more room to maneuver, creatively speaking. Anyway, that's about it for this particular video. I'm sure there's loads of other stuff I could have covered, and after having made this video, I'm sure I will remember plenty of things that I probably should have mentioned here. If I did forget something, feel free to point it out in the comments. In fact, by all means, share what ideas you guys have, what little predictions you have for The Elder Scrolls 6. Assuming that's the next game that's going to be coming, which I'm pretty sure it is. So anyway, my name's SorcererDave, and that was a bit of a ramble on the subject of where the Elder Scrolls series and Bethesda's games in general seem to be going in the near future. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.